Born into the extreme poverty that was Chairman Mao's China and randomly chosen at age 11 to change his life, eventually he made it to the West and became one of the best male classical dancers of our time. Hi, I'm Ernie Manouse. Coming up on Interviews, our conversation with dancer and now author Li Cunxin. Can a great dancer be trained, or do they have to be born that way?
I think you have to have both. You have to have some talent, but I think at the end of the day that might only be accounting for 20 or 30% of your success. The rest, the 80 or 70% of that is hard work, is have a great work ethic, have determination, and just really work your butt off to really achieve what you want to achieve.
Do you think you always had the gift of dance in you, or is it something that you found?
Well, I came from a poor peasant background, poverty-stricken, and at any given day, the tree barks in my village were all being eaten. So my parents were never educated. So my entire life never had any arts or cultural. So that dance or ballet came to me as an utter surprise to me or to my family.
Did you know it existed? Did you have an understanding that there was culture out there?
The only ballet we saw was on a film. It's called The Red Detachment of Women, which is Madame Mao's cultural models. And it was a propaganda ballet, was served for Mao's political purpose, and where they danced with swords and grenades and guns in their hands. And it was wild. And it was really, it was a heavily political themed ballet. Dance or artistic merit came secondary.
Yeah. When you mention poverty-stricken, I don't think everyone grasps how low down that is. Explain a little bit about what your life was like.
I was born into a peasant family. I was the sixth of 7 sons. My parents did not go to school for a single day, so they couldn't read or write. But there were about 30 million people died of starvation in China a few years before I was born. So there was no running water, there was no heating, and at winter time, my hometown, the temperature could drop down to as low as 20 degrees below zero, and it's freezing. So, and there's only a few hours of electricity each night. So utterly, life was incredible. Every time when my mother served the meal for the family, for the entire family, we would look at the meal that's served. Then we would look at our mother with desperate begging, wanting to know if there's any food, because before we even started, just by look at, we knew we were going to go to sleep starving that night. The food that served was not going to be enough to eat for all of us.
Did you know there was a life outside of all that, though? Did you understand how other people in the world lived at the same time?
Well, we knew what the people around us lived in the same village, what their life was like, which was some people were even poorer than us. And one of my playmates, when I was about 6 or 7, happily played with me one day. The next day, he just died because he had ate something out of total starvation and had a terrible infection. There was no money for his parents to take him to the hospital. So he suddenly died about a week or so later. But we were told when we grew up by the Chinese propaganda that we lived in the most glorious, most prosperous life. Lucky. We were very lucky to be born under Mao's China. So our impression of the Western world was even much poorer. They lived in a much poorer life, and the sky was gray. They lived in the dark ages. So we grew up with that impression.
Yeah. When you went to school, what was school like?
My school. I didn't go to school until when I was 9 because there's no classrooms available. So this simple commune shack, no heating. that particular winter where I was when I was selected to go to the Madame Mau's Peking Dance Academy, just as when I was about turning 11. And that day was freezingly cold, snowing very, very hard. My mother had sewn this thick cotton quilted coat and pants. I looked like this round snowball reading "I Love You, Chairman Mao" text in this freezing cold room. Suddenly, 4 gentlemen walk out into the room, looking dignified the way they dressed, and it was just not the ordinary people in my hometown. Suddenly, they were introduced to us as Madame Mao's cultural advisors from the Beijing Dance Academy to select talents to train as ballet dancers. But again, as I said earlier, we didn't know anything about ballet, and we were asked to stand up to sing "I Love You, Chairman Mao" songs. As we sang, these 4 gentlemen walk along the aisles, look at each person's faces. There were about over 40 of us. They passed me by without taking any notice. They selected 1 girl out of the 40-odd kids. Just as when they were about to walk out of the room, my teacher hesitated and eventually tapped on the shoulder for the very last gentleman. Just as he was about to walk out the door, she said, "Excuse me, sir, what about that one?" And that one was me. Just years later, when I tracked her down, I said, "Teacher Son, please tell me, why did you single me out that day? For what reason?" She said, "For years, Li, I wondered. I still don't really know why I point you out that day. But all I thought at that moment was you ran fast." I ran fast in my sports classes, and that was the sole reason she pointed me out. But then suddenly I was put into, sort of led into this room, which is the only room in the school had the little heater, which is the head of the school's office. We were torn. They take all our clothes off. They measured us inch by inch of our bodies. There were about 10 of us there from all different classes was selected there. And suddenly I was pushed against the wall. One person held one of my knees straight. The other person pushed both my shoulders firmly against the wall, so I could not move a single inch. The third person lifted the other leg high up in the air. As he lifted, he kept on asking me, "Does it hurt?" And it was excruciating. They have torn both of my hamstrings that day. But stubbornly, I knew deep inside of me that that was my one and only chance that I have dreamed about to get out of that vicious life.
I'm sure you've thought about and wondered, what if you hadn't been chosen, what your life would have been? Any idea how it would have gone from looking at your family or other people in the village?
I would have been a peasant working in the field for the rest of my life. Just like one of the stories in my father's fables, the little frog was born in a well, which he never knew anything other than his little environment, his little patch of sky. That's what he was taught by his father. That's all life had to offer, until one day he met this land frog. The land frog told him what was up in the real world. From that moment onwards, he desperately tried to escape that fate he was born into, which, like his father and his forefathers, never could escape it. And then one day when my father told me that story, I said to my father, "Are we living in a well?" And his answer was, "I certainly would not call our life heaven." And from that moment onwards, I wanted desperately to escape the fate I was born into, and I wanted to do something special with my life. And maybe then I could come back to help my family.
So you're 11 years old, just chosen to go to the academy. What happens? Are you taken away from your family? What's the relationship?
I was terribly homesick. We were not allowed to visit our families until the end of the year. So once a year we were allowed. I was really sobbing myself to sleep at night, clutching onto my mother's quilt. And I did not want other people to discover my tears, so I covered myself at nighttime just for quite many times during these first 2 years. Our training was brutal at the Peking Dance Academy. We got up at 5:30 in the morning, went all the way to 9 o'clock at night, 6 days a week. And the training was utterly brutal. And it was this incredible Russian training, but we were shouted at, and it was an incredible life, and taught me discipline, taught me determination. once I fell in love with ballet, I strapped sandbags on both of my legs, hopped up and down on one leg on 4 flights of stairs at 5 o'clock in the morning to train my jumping ability. And I would sneak away at nighttime, light this little candle in the dark studio, endlessly practice my turns so I would not be discovered. I can't turn the light on because then otherwise I would be have to go back to bed again. So I was endlessly trying to sort of practice my spotting in my turns. I felt if I could turn in the dark light, I could turn with lights on stage.
What was it about ballet, though, that spoke to you? Was it the love of the art form, or was it the escape that it promised you?
At first, I thought I was lucky to get a bowl of rice for the first time in my life, have enough food to eat when I was at the Peking Dance Academy. And then eventually, through this wonderful teacher who was my mentor, who discovered me at the end of my second year at the Beijing Dance Academy, he loved ballet with passion, and one of his missions was he felt I was talented, and he wanted me to look at ballet through his eyes, and that did it for me. And he guided me, he nurtured me, he encouraged me to really get into the process of loving that ballet. And eventually, I loved ballet with passion. I realized how beautiful this art form truly is, and the music, maybe it's music because I was starved of music for the rest of my life. So when I first heard a beautiful piece of music played with this wonderful piano, and I just thought, my God, this was heaven. And so that music combined with the graceful movements of the dance took my heart away. So from that moment onward, I worked probably harder than anybody at the Peking Dance Academy. And in the end, from a hopeless dance in ballet student, became one of the top in China.
When they talk about things like this, you often hear people say survivor guilt. Was there any part of you that felt guilty that you were getting this life, that you had your bowl of rice and your family didn't? Was there a part that ever was difficult to deal with?
For all these 7 years when I was at the Peking Dance Academy, every time I had a bowl of rice, every time I had a fruit, I had an apple or banana, I cannot stop myself from thinking, I wished I could give this bowl of rice or half of the bowl of rice or this fruit to my mother. I knew they were still starving back home. Only if I could kept it for them, I would have done it. And it was just, and years later when I came to America, that was the same way. I never took life for granted. I treasured everything, all the beautiful things life had to offer, and I really constantly tried to remember what it was like back in China. And I could never forget that. So when I had the very first opportunity to send money home to my family, to my parents, to my brothers, I did. Yeah. And I'm still doing that today.
There was a point where you came to this country, you got invited here for a school to learn more dance here. How did that come about?
Amazing. It's an amazing opportunity, sort of almost by fate, just like the day I was selected to study ballet and the day I was discovered by this teacher in Beijing. And in 1979, I was discovered by Ben Stevenson, who was the artistic director of the Houston Ballet, and now the artistic director of the Texas Ballet Theater in Dallas-Fort Worth. And he went to China with the very first cultural delegation from America to China. That was in 1979, and there he taught a couple of master classes. He discovered me, offered 2 scholarships to come to study at the Houston Ballet Academy summer school that year.
Why? Let me stop you there and just ask, why did the government allow that?
Well, Deng Xiaoping had took over power a couple of years before that. So China had just started to gradually open up. But when Ben Stevenson gave the invitation, they didn't think anything about it. They didn't think that was going to happen at all. But very quickly, they got a phone call from Deng Xiaoping's office, says, have you done anything with these 2 scholarships? They didn't know then George Bush Sr. was actually the first ambassador to China, but Barbara Bush was on the board of the Houston Ballet. So it was that connection we actually luckily got to America. And we didn't speak a word of English. It was just everything was, lost. We were totally lost, almost like in space.
You tell a great story about going out to dinner when you first got here.
That's right. We were taken to this wonderful Chinese restaurant in Houston. For the very first time in my life, I had Peking duck. And the night, the food was just kept coming out. It was the most delicious food we ever had. But of course, we were told by the Chinese officials is when people speak to you or ask you questions, if you did not understand, you should never say the word no. You should always smile, nod your head, say yes. By the end of the evening, we were just utterly stuffed. We were so full. Of course, still, my director kept asking us, are you still hungry? We didn't understand a word he said, so we smiled, nodded our head, and said yes.
So you kept eating and you enjoyed that, huh?
It was wonderful. I mean, what actually, even though we had this incredible food, but what I found was so disturbing was the amount of waste.
Yeah.
That night, there was so much food left on that table, and it just broke my heart. I just thought only if I could put it all into a doggy box and take it back
What must you have thought, though, of this land when you came here, from what you'd come from before, from what you'd been taught about what you'd find here? Had you already learned it wouldn't be that, or was it total culture shock?
It was a total culture shock. What we saw did not fit into what we were taught for the first 18 years of my life. It just did not fit. Yeah. And at first I thought, well, the streets are clean. I thought they could really sweep the streets to impress us, these two Chinese communists coming. But they cannot simply build these huge high-rise buildings, these enormous highways, just to impress us. And when people give us flowers and cowboy hats when we first arrived in the Houston airport, I just thought, should we take it or should we not? Should we refuse it? Because we thought there must be some hidden agenda behind those smiling faces, behind this cowboy hat and the flowers, because we did not trust the American people.
When did you come to trust? Because I know where your story's going, and we'll get to that in a second, but there had to be some trust before you were going to do what you did next.
That realization of that propaganda, for 18 years of propaganda we had in China, came to me gradually. And very gradually I realized that was really all wrong. And that was served one purpose only, was to serve Mao's, sort of political propaganda to get us all become very, very faithful for his Cultural Revolution or for his, Communist Revolution. So, but as a young Communist Youth Party leader, of which I was, and that realization was devastating, because that means 18 years of my learning, of my beliefs, had all crumbled right in front of me. I felt like there was a carpet or the floor have taken away from me and just right underneath me. So what do I need to believe? Right. And it was a really, really enlightening moment, but it's a devastating moment at the same time.
Yeah. And then you decide, through, I guess, a series of events, to stay in this country.
That's right.
How did that come about?
Well, I fell in love with this beautiful young American girl who was also a student at the Houston Ballet Academy. And she was my first love, which was just so beautiful. And for the very first time in my life, I felt I could love somebody freely and being loved freely. Which back in China, if I fell in love with somebody, I have to truly go to my political advisor and say, may I talk about my feelings to that girl? And I was not allowed to go directly to that girl to express my feelings. So by having that love, and it was incredible. So I married her, and I went into the Chinese consulate in Houston to explain my marriage. And they were supposed to let me go in a few minutes. We'll be on our honeymoon. And finally, suddenly, I was dragged away by 4 guards and locked up at the consulate for 21 hours in this dark room. Was interrogated. And I was threatened for my life, but also I was so worried my parents and my family in China, back in China, was going to be in trouble.
Well, let me understand this. If you got married, did you assume then you'd be able to stay in this country, or were you still responsible to go back?
My intention was to go back to China with my wife to live in China, dance in China for half the year, and be able to come back to the West to dance for half a year. But the Chinese consulate official, I think they felt personally responsible for what I did, and they were really scared they were going to get the blame So they did not want to hear any of that. They said, no, we decide your fate. We decide your life. What are you going to do? You are not going to marry that person without our blessing, which had that direct conflict with what the Western society and the rights of human rights was all about.
Right.
So eventually I was released unharmed, and apparently the FBI had surrounded the consulate for at that time, which I didn't know then, and Vice President George Bush was involved because Barbara Bush was still on the board of the Houston Ballet. By that point, I got to know them quite well, and then eventually the top Chinese government says, release him. And the funny thing was that the Chinese consulate in Houston had unplugged all the telephone calls. By the time they discovered this lawyer, Charles Foster, had been making phone calls to the State Department, to the federal judge and all that, and there was a federal judge court-martial ordered for them to produce me at the court the next day. So there was huge amount of pressure from the legal side and from the the government side of it. So eventually, I was released, and I was amazed. I walked out of that consulate alive.
Yeah.
And it was the darkest 24 hours of my life. And the worst of all, the thought of never be able to see my beloved mother, father, my brothers and friends back in China was just unbearable.
When you walked out, when you were free in a sense, what was your understanding of what your relationship would be allowed to be with your family back home?
I never thought I would ever see them again. And in fact, I did not see them for 5 long years. And those 5 long years, the sadness, the tears had virtually nearly, suffocated me.
Yeah.
And the guilt. The guilt of the unknown, maybe my action, what I did, had implicated them, had caused them trouble. And I wrote them a couple of letters and didn't get any response. And I thought I better stop writing because otherwise, I would continue to causing problems for them. But I think China had opened up so much, and eventually I discovered they were not implicated at all.
Really?
Which was just amazing.
Were they told of what was going on? Did they know the struggle you were going through?
The few Chinese officials paid a visit to my parents a few days after my defection, and they were basically accused my parents for have such a bastard son. And my mother turned around to them and says, "You took my son away at age 11. You were responsible for his upbringing, for his education. Now you have lost my son. I want him back." And she was heartbreaking because she did not know whether her son was still alive or dead. So for her, she felt she had lost her son, her 6th son, forever. And I was their hope. I was their hope of being able to come back to help them. Suddenly, I had disappeared from the earth.
Yeah. Did you ever question whether it was all worth it? During those 5 years when you had no contact with your family, was there any guilt in what you had done?
I think it's always the best thing to look at, things in hindsight. And now looking back, I think everything what I have done had worth it.
Right.
However, it was in great sacrifice, great pain, great sort of a struggle to get to where I am, not just to be able to live with those sadness, those fear, these nightmares for all these years, but also the struggle to be the best in the dance world and to do the utter best to become one of the top dancers in the world. Coming from being a Chinese, ballet is not something natural. It's not a Peking opera, and is a Western art form. So for me to be recognized to be one of the world's top dancers, it was not easy. I put a lot of hard work, a lot of dedication into it.
When you look back on your life, which I guess you had to do recently when you wrote all of this in the book, and you look back on your life, do you realize that's the same person? Do you feel a connection, or does that seem like just a story you know now?
Well, I was amazed when I was writing my autobiography to reflect upon my journey. I was amazed that was all me.
Yeah.
And sometimes I still think, did that really happen to me? Did I really got out of the Chinese consulate alive? Was I really allowed to see my parents? And I still remember that day when they came to see me performing Ballet for the very first time ever. And the airplane was late to arrive in Houston. And the people, friends, picked them up from the airport, rushed them through the Houston traffic with the police escort over to the theater directly. And they held the curtain for 20 minutes. We were doing the opening night Nutcracker. And when they walked in, by the time they walked in, the whole audience knew my parents were arriving from China to see me dance for the very first time. When they walked in, the whole audience started to applaud for them. And my poor mother just started sobbing from that moment onwards.
Yeah.
It was just really an emotional moment when they came back on stage during the intermission. The three of us looked at each other, just utterly speechless. We were just hugged in a pool of tears. And it was the most special moment in my entire life.
Well, it's funny you talk about your culture shock. I can't even imagine what it was like for your mother to all of a sudden be in the midst of all this, because her transformation happened immediately.
That's
her youth
right.
had years.
That's right. She had her first car ride, her first train ride, the first airplane ride, and walking into a Western theater for the very first time in her life. So it was just for them, the culture shock was even bigger.
Well, Li, thank you very much for telling this story. It's an amazing tale, and you've finally written it down. I hear there's a movie in the works, possibly?
Well, there are quite a few offers, film offers on the table at the moment, so I'm quite excited about that aspect of things.
The best of luck to you. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Li Cunxin. To order a transcript, call 866-652-3378 or send $6.95 to the address on your screen. Please include the name of the guest.